Have you ever been to Japan? For example, to this large, rapidly developing city where skyscrapers rise like mushrooms after the rain? Welcome to Hiroshima. Hiroshima? You might ask. But Hiroshima is supposed to be. Alright then. Here's another Japanese city, Nagasaki. What do you think? Yes, Nagasaki too. Could it be that the modern residents of these cities have been deliberately misled and know nothing about the danger? Maybe someone urgently needs to inform the Japanese that they're living in a deadly radiation zone? But before calling emergency services, let's take a moment to recall what we actually know about radiation. It's quite a common property of matter. The sun, for instance, is essentially a giant hydrogen bomb that emits photons across a broad spectrum, along with ions and gamma radiation, in other words, radiation. The force that heats the Earth from within, from the so-called Earth's core, is also related to the nuclear decay of heavy transuranic elements. Radiation is emitted by soil, living organisms, and even some medical equipment. So, it turns out that radiation surrounds us everywhere and penetrates our bodies. You may have heard the term natural background radiation. In some places it's just 0.015 milliroentgens per hour, in others it's 10 times higher, and still considered natural. However, it's quite likely that high levels of natural radiation in some areas are just as natural as the levels of heavy metals in bodies of water where factory waste is dumped. Now, imagine what would happen if 209 nuclear warheads with a total yield of around 250 megatons were detonated across the territory of Russia. You might say, don't even say that, that would be the end of the world. But how would you respond to official data stating that between 1949 and 1963, exactly that number of nuclear weapons bombarded the territory of the Soviet Union? Here's the American bomb nicknamed Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima on August 9, 1945. Now multiply that bomb by 16,600 times, that's the total power of the strikes carried out on the USSR between 1949 and 1963. It's as if the British launched their entire arsenal of 160 nuclear warheads into the uninhabited regions of the Soviet Union. How could this be possible? Soviet nuclear tests were conducted at two major test sites, in Semipalatinsk and on Novaya Zemlya. Take the Semipalatinsk site, for example. It was and still is located in a relatively populated area. Logically, it should have been placed near the North Pole or somewhere deep in Siberia. When the first test nuclear bomb was detonated, a brand new town, Kurchatov, was only about 60 kilometers away. In 1954, another town, Chagan, appeared just 80 kilometers from the site. Now imagine living in one of those towns. You step out onto your balcony to breathe the fresh morning air. Suddenly, a flash. What was that, lightning, your wife might ask. No, just another nuclear bomb test, you reply. Really, what's the big deal? No panic at all. About 100 atmospheric, i.e., not underground, nuclear and thermonuclear devices of varying yields, from 1 kiloton to several megatons, were detonated with an average frequency of once a month. Even a very low-yield device of just 1 kiloton creates a distinct mushroom cloud about 3 kilometers high. A 1 megaton device produces a cloud around 19 kilometers high. The total explosive yield of all ground-based nuclear tests at the Semipalatinsk site was about 100 megatons. If all of these devices had been detonated at once, an area of 240 by 240 kilometers would have received a deadly radiation dose of 30 sieverts, SV. For comparison, a person exposed to just 0.05 sieverts is already considered irradiated. It is precisely the fact that the bombs were not detonated all at once, but rather in a strictly measured sequence over time, that made the explosion significantly less dangerous, including in terms of radioactive exposure. We've all been taught since school that land affected by a nuclear explosion becomes uninhabitable and even fatally dangerous. Drinking water from such an area would at the very least lead to severe radiation poisoning and genetic mutations, and at worst, a slow and agonizing death. But all of that is in theory. What about in practice? Across many continents, you can spot massive, perfectly round depressions and lakes here and there that suspiciously resemble craters left by powerful explosions. Take, for example, one such lake, called Chagan. Since Soviet times, livestock have come here to drink. Just an ordinary lake, it seems. In reality, it's a genuine radioactive crater, formed in 1965 as a result of a 170 kiloton thermonuclear explosion. The device was placed in a borehole 178 meters deep in the bed of the small Chagan River, not far from the Semipalatinsk test site. By the late 1990s, the radioactive contamination of the lake water was estimated at 300 picocuries per liter, while the maximum permissible level of alpha particle radioactivity in drinking water is only 15 picocuries per liter. Nevertheless, the lake has been used as a watering hole for livestock throughout all these years. And in over 50 years, no radiation-related illnesses have been detected in either the animals or the herders. In this case, we can say with certainty what caused the formation of the perfectly round lake, something that cannot be said about many other seemingly natural lakes and craters with the same flawless geometric shape. Just think of the numerous perfectly circular lakes found across the territory of Russia. And then there's the site of a terrible disaster, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Footage from a Google Street View 360 camera in 2017 shows that people are gradually returning to the city. Shops are opening, and occasional pedestrians can be seen on the streets. In fact, many residents never even left the area right after the explosion. At the very least, no photos have captured anyone with 2 heads, 3 legs, or anything like that. In short, life goes on. Life goes on as well in the Japanese cities with a hellish past, Fukushima and Nagasaki. And these cities are, in fact, far more technologically advanced than most Russian cities that have never been subjected to atomic bombings. As for atmospheric nuclear explosions, detonated at 30 to 50 meters above the ground, in these cases, the majority of radioactive isotopes are released high into the atmosphere. These microscopic particles then disperse, contaminating vast areas, sometimes on a global scale. From the stratosphere, isotopes can take several years to fall back to Earth. That's why, taking weather conditions into account, working at such a test site is considered relatively safe. The colossal release of isotopes, heat, and dust into the upper layers of the atmosphere as a result of the detonation of 530 nuclear warheads could not help but affect the climate and the natural background radiation. Many people who lived through the 1960s noted that winters during that period became milder, while the summer seasons turned cooler. Some modern researchers have turned their attention to an interesting phenomenon, tree rings. It turns out that starting from the 1960s, the summer growth of trees noticeably slowed down, which is reflected in the narrowing of annual rings. In 1963, the nuclear powers came to an agreement. From that point on, nuclear bomb tests would only be conducted underground. It seems that world leaders had begun to realize just how serious the climate consequences of playing around with nuclear weapons could be. But does that really change much? After all, the Fukushima disaster was reportedly triggered by an underground nuclear explosion. But we'll talk about that another time. A video on that topic is coming soon on our channel. For now, let's recall something else. In the first half of the 20th century, when radioactivity was still poorly understood, radium and thorium were considered beneficial to health. They were added to medicines, ointments, and even cosmetics, such as powders and facial creams. Radioactive metals were used to make compresses and even a kind of water activator, which involved leaving radium in water overnight and drinking it in the morning, believing it had become extra healthy. What would happen to a person who regularly consumed small doses of radium-226 and radium-228 mixed with distilled water? Your first thought is probably, they wouldn't survive for long, and their death would be agonizing. Take, for example, the radioactive tablets. Just one of these tiny pills exposed a person to about 1 microcurie of radiation. Back then, taking such supplements was considered beneficial, and there were no widespread deaths or sudden outbreaks of radiation sickness. As the saying goes, moderation is key. However, radioactive gained notoriety in 1932 after it led to the death of Eben McBurney Byers, an American athlete who, over 2 years, drank around 1,400 bottles of this so-called miracle cure. He received a radiation dose 3 times the lethal limit. After 3 years of taking the product, he lost all his teeth, part of his jaw, and his bones became dangerously soft. Eventually, 2 years later, Byers died. The medical use of radiation began when Henri Cottard discovered that cancer cells in the larynx could be suppressed in their early stages with a small dose of radiation, supposedly without side effects. This method of treating tumors became known as the Cottard-Rigaud method, and it is still used in medicine today. Another telling example, the construction of the first nuclear reactor on the Eurasian continent, known as F-1, under the leadership of the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, Igor Vasilyevich Kurchatov. The building where the reactor was located, and even the personnel working there, had no special protection. But the most astonishing part is this: the reactor was assembled and disassembled by hand, quite literally. Small cylinders of radioactive metal were inserted into graphite blocks, with bare hands, and no protective gear whatsoever. Nuclear physicists will probably comment that the F-1 reactor was a so-called zero-power reactor, meaning it had extremely low energy output and didn't require cooling. And yes, modern nuclear fuel is far more powerful and dangerous. But still, you can always find someone wandering around it wearing only a helmet as protection. So, what is radiation really? Is it truly as dangerous as the vast majority of people believe? There's certainly a lot to think about. If you have thoughts or ideas, share them in the comments. If you believe this video deserves a like, thank you for the support. That's all for today. See you next time.